ਇੱਕ ਓੰਕਾਰ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਸ੍ਰੀ ਭਵਾਨੀ ਜੀ ਸਹਾਇ, ਸ੍ਰੀ ਮਾਇਆ ਲక్ష్ਮੀ ਜੀ ਸਹਾਇ। ਉਸਤਤ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਮਾਇਆ.
Section 4. Taxes, welfare and safety nets. Reconciling freedom with providing social security. Inequality and poverty. The problem of income and wealth inequality has been present throughout history in many societies. The only difference is that in the modern age, inequality has taken a slightly different guise. Whereas before it tended to be the rulers and the nobles hoarding all the wealth and power, these days there exist private individuals with net worths greater than GDPs of entire nations. Although this is indeed a problem, it may not be in the way that is initially assumed to be. So if you're just listening, you won't be able to see this diagram, but I'll encourage you guys to go to the website and see the diagram, because what we're showing on the what's being shown on the diagram here is two countries. So on the top of the diagram we can see country A, and in country A there's a gap between the poorest and the richest, represented by that white sort of rectangle, right? So the poorest person is at the left hand side of the white rectangle and the richest guy is on the right hand side, and the gap between them that's what we call inequality, right? The gap between the poorest and the richest. Now country B's got the same, but it's got a smaller gap. But which country would you rather live in? Would you rather live in the country where even the poorest are richer than the richest of country B? Or would you rather live in country B when even the richest person is not as rich as the poorest of country A, right? So instantly what you should be thinking here is that maybe inequality isn't what we've been fed, that, oh yeah, inequality equals poverty. Actually, inequality is a secondary issue to poverty. What you should matter more is how rich is the poorest person in your country, no matter how big the gap is, no matter how rich the richest person is. That's what the real issue is, and we'll go into it again here. So figure 1 above shows the inequality between two nations. Although country A has the larger inequality, the poorest are still richer than the richest of country B. Despite its simplicity, the purpose of this example is to highlight a key component to this debate that is often overlooked. Inequality is a secondary issue to that of poverty. If everyone in a nation is getting richer, then in theory it should matter less that some have made more money than others. The primary concern should be how they've made their money, not how much. In the real world, there are many different measures for calculating economic inequality, one of the more popular being the Gini coefficient. This measures the proportion of the wealth held by a number of individuals in a nation. A Gini coefficient of 1 means that one person earned all the income, perfect inequality, where 0 would be represent every person earning the exact same income. To highlight the concept of the above example using the OECD data, the values for both Luxembourg and Spain are similar, 0.327 and 0.333 respectively. Yet when looking at GDP per capita, they differ greatly, $112,000 compared to $39,000. Inequality is not static either. Just because someone is poorer now doesn't mean they will always be. Economic maneuverability is another important metric that must be considered here. In a research paper examining the likelihood of experiencing relative poverty in the US, Rank and Herschel report on the periods of time in which people enter and remain the bottom 10% and 20%. The findings show that although 61.8% of people may enter the bottom 20%, after 1 year this rate drops to 38.2%. This then continues to fall, whereby only 5.6% remain in this percentile for 10 or more consecutive years. For the bottom 10%, 42.1% enter this level for at least a year, which further reduces by roughly half to 20.5% after 1 year. Only about 1.5% stay at this level for 10 or more years consecutively. However, again, this is relative poverty, not absolute, which is an important distinction. Where absolute poverty is measured in terms of a set threshold level, relative looks at the bottom percentiles in relation to the average income of the population. This means that the poorest of a relatively high average income nation may have higher standards of living than the poorest of a lower average income nation. The upper stratas also show similar levels of mobility too. 56% of Americans expect to reach the top 10% in their lifetimes, and 73% getting into the top 20%. Of the top 1%, 11.1% of people are expected to reach this stage. However, this plummets to 4.5% after 1 year, and only about 0.6% will remain here consecutively after 10 years. There are a variety of factors that lead to these changes over the course of people's life. Marriage, selling homes, losing or obtaining new jobs, and much more. Despite this, it is common to hear the solutions of inequality falling more along the lines of forcible redistribution of wealth from the 1%, as if this was a fixed group of people hoarding all the wealth. However, it is crucial to understand that this is not a zero-sum game. One of the most prevalent economic myths today is the fixed pie fallacy. This is the assumption that there is a fixed amount of wealth in this world, and so if one person becomes wealthier, it is because they have taken more from someone else. The same way a pie is fixed in size and must be sliced up and divided between recipients. If one person cuts a bigger slice for themselves, it naturally will leave everyone else with less. The problem is, however, wealth cannot be compared to a pie, since wealth grows. With every invention or innovation comes an increase in the amount or quality of goods and services available in society, often creating entire new industries in which people can enter and expand. Efficiency may also be increased as new ways of production are developed to better meet the demands of the people. As new areas of human potential are unlocked, previously unrealized opportunities become manifest. Jobs in less physically demanding areas become more accessible, and the fruits of this labor become increasingly rewarding. With better products and services available due to the societal increase in wealth, everyone benefits. It is often a mistake to judge wealth expansion solely in terms of money alone, since the range and quality of goods and services now available must also be considered. In wealthy nations, the poorest still have access to advanced technology such as smartphones, cars, fridges, etc., all of which would have blown the minds of even the richest 100 years ago. Increasing wealth for all, as opposed to just a few, is mutually beneficial for all parties involved. The fact that the market is structured in this way naturally creates an incentive to increase societal wealth as a whole, since for companies especially, this means more potential customers are available. As an entrepreneur, would you rather sell your product in an area of high wealth or in a desert where nobody lives? By creating and sustaining positive feedback loops such as these, the level of wealth increases. Statements such as the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer are simply untrue. Hans Gosling, through his work with Gapminder, revealed many misconceptions people have regarding the current state of affairs in the world. He showed that many often think of things are often worse or are getting much worse than they actually are. Some of the most striking examples of this has been regarding global poverty levels. Participants of the surveys were asked to pick what level of the world's population live in extreme poverty today, considering that in 1980 it was 40%. 92% of the respondents got this wrong, expecting a rise or less reduction than the actual level of 10%. Despite inequality increasing, the level of poverty has plummeted alongside infant mortality rates, longer lifespan, and general increase in quality of life. A more reasonable conclusion based on the facts are that the rich are getting richer at a faster rate than the poor are getting richer, but we are all indeed getting richer. Which makes sense. Those with more money have more available to invest and grow. A 7% increase in £1 million compared to £100,000 is far more in real money terms. Crucially, the rich are better able to capitalise from compounding interest especially, since they have more money compounding or even aware of the power of compounding in the first place. To see wealth as a zero-sum game is fundamentally flawed. Many have made this mistake, predicting that as the population increased, poverty would also, as there would be less to go around. The reality thankfully proved them wrong, as poverty has reduced drastically despite the booming population growth over the last century. Human beings are not cattle or crops. We have the capacity to think and manipulate our environment in order to solve innumerable problems. Human ingenuity is the reason why you can read these words right now. Having more people means more opportunity to create wealth and innovate, thereby circumnavigating or at least reducing the magnitude of many great threats such as disease, natural disaster and war. Admittedly, innovation has brought its own problems as well, such as climate change and superbugs. However, this is just more reason to innovate further. To achieve this, a nation must nourish free thinking and give people greater opportunities to solve these problems by getting the government out of their way. Despite this, if the issue of overpopulation still seems concerning, solace can be taken in some of the other incredible work conducted by the Gapminder Institute on this topic. Hans Gosling explains that the current predictions estimate that human population has begun to plateau and may peak at 11 billion by 2100. In the past and amongst the developing nations, the number of children per household averaged much higher than it is now. This was mainly due to the nature of work which required support from larger family units, and given the fact most children ended up dying before reaching adulthood, there was a greater incentive to have more children in order to ensure that at least a few of them would survive. However, these justifications no longer hold as much weight as the world is developing. Thanks to advancements in medicine, hygiene and new work opportunities, more children are living longer and surviving. Increasingly, it is becoming more infeasible for the poorest to have so many children, since that is more mouths to feed. With the education becoming more accessible, their children can attain better jobs away from hard labour, escape poverty and uplift their whole families. These reasons contribute to the diminished incentive to have so many children, and to give more focus on the ones people do have. Eventually, the birth rate would likely reach an equilibrium with the death rate and give the planet a constant population level of approximately 11 billion. Although poverty has indeed dropped, it has not done so equally across all nations. When reading the above, your mind may have instinctively visualized families from in some African nation or Bangladesh, etc. This isn't racism. The fact is, the so-called West and other developed nations have seen unprecedented rates of wealth creation, and as a result, their populations suffer far less from poverty. We can cry about this, complain, and give all manner of excuses, or we can learn from it and explore the real reasons as to why this disparity exists. If we really want to understand how to build a successful nation in which poverty is minute, if it exists at all, and the people are able to prosper and live free, we must understand the reality of the situation by putting aside emotion and adopting reason. It may be easy to stick all the blame for this on the colonial powers of the past few centuries, namely Britain in particular. However, something was unique about these invaders compared to the past. Many empires have risen and fallen, and many kings were able to amass great hoards of wealth through conquest and plunder. But these modern nations were able to keep hold of their riches in a far different way. By granting some level of economic freedom, wealth is more successfully disseminated amongst a greater proportion of the population outside the elites. This is not a defence of the British Empire in the slightest, and in fact, colonisation as a whole is strictly antithetical to Azadist principles. The East India Company was a state-backed monopoly, granted exclusive trade rights in India by their monarch, which, as we discussed in the previous section, is completely opposite to what Azadism advocates. Alongside this, Azadists take a strong position that the British Empire, along with many others, have ultimately caused vastly more harm than good. In fact, any good that did come out of it was attached to costs so high it was ridiculous to suggest that any of it was for the best. The sheer number of lives lost, families destroyed, cultures dismantled, religions distorted, and spirits crushed can have no compensation. The devastating effects socially, economically, philosophically are inarguable for these invaded nations. Instead, what this analysis focuses on is what happened to that accumulated wealth in the invaders' home countries. It is not so simple to say they just stole from other nations and this is why they became so rich, since in these cases, it was not just the ruling class that kept the wealth. It was used in a way that maintained that wealth and expanded upon it. Many theories have been suggested as to why some nations are richer than others, as outlined in the opening chapters of Ace Molyneux and Robinson's book, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Poverty. Race, culture and climate have all been used in the past to explain these differences. However, geography in particular has been a particularly prevalent theory, and for good reason. In Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, Chapter 3 goes through the limiting factors associated with the division of labour, in which he highlights the importance of transport in opening up trade and getting access to the world markets. He uses the example of ships revolutionising the transport of goods and services by allowing for more to be shipped using less labour over greater distances and in less time than traditional horse and carriage. These factors allow for the economies of the port cities to flourish far greater than remote inland settlements due to the greater access to other markets and a more efficient method of trade. Looking into the history of empires and nation-states, those that were situated on coastlines or had access to ports and the sea tended to progress far greater than those that had not. Even today, some of the world's most wealthy nations are city-states such as Hong Kong, Singapore and Taiwan, which have extensive ports and sea networks linked to them. Even Maharaja Ranjit Singh had ambitions to reach the ocean before the kingdom collapsed. Alternatively, isolation has been repeatedly shown to prove disastrous in promoting prosperity. Thomas Sowell expressed the failure of isolationism as an economic policy by pointing out how historically those societies that kept to themselves and avoided interactions with foreigners led to much diminished levels of success in comparison. Smith also alluded to this in his own time using examples of settlements and cities that were located further inland and comparing them to port towns or cities located on shorelines or the banks of great rivers. These factors made trade far easier and thus wealth was able to be transferred and grow for the mutual benefit of all involved. However, the geography hypothesis can only be taken so far, and although it may help understand the difference between cities and regions, it can fall short when scaling up to the level of nations. Ace Molyneux and Robinson instead reject this in favour of a new perspective, suggesting that it is the ease of access to institutions that is the most important factor. By pointing out a series of examples around the world of nations with similar geographies but with huge disparities in wealth, they put the idea that some places are just better suited than others under scrutiny. North and South Korea, despite their once vast similarities in race, culture and geography, could not be more different in their trajectories after their split. Why is this? The US and Mexico is another relevant example, with the town of Nogales being one of the case studies used in their book. This town is divided by a border, half in Mexico and the other half in the US. However, on the US side, the residents earn 3 times more, have lower crime rates, and live longer lives. The reason for this lies in the formation and subsequent development of these two nations. Mexico's land and resources was far superior to North America's, and its people were quickly enslaved. The Europeans landing further north, though, faced far more resistance, harder terrain, and poorer land quality, whereas the Spaniards to the south established institutions to exploit the native inhabitants and created a system in which to keep them merely on a subsistence level, and therefore reliant on their invaders. If not outright enslaved, they would be forced to work for low wages, pay high taxes, and inflated prices for goods and services. This time-tested model expanded the wealth of the royal families and conquistadors, but at the expense of the economic prosperity of the nation as a whole. The resource and labour-rich southern regions being thoroughly exploited, the English arriving late were left with the inferior northern territories. Initially failing to replicate the Spaniards' policies, they instead were forced to grow their own food and trade. Their initial plan to kidnap the natives as king and hold him ransom was not viable. Rather, they had to negotiate and work with them, for now at least. Their intentions then turned towards exploiting their fellow colonists instead, and so they set up a large corporation, the Virginia Company, who owned all the land, and new settlers from Europe were then forced to work under grueling conditions in predefined roles and oversaw by company agents. Naturally, people began to run away into the frontier, and in response, the company imposed death penalties for anyone caught deserting. Inevitably, this system collapsed as people from Europe became aware of the situation, thus avoiding the law. With the population dwindling, the Virginia Company had to change its tactics, realizing that the typical colonial strategy was not feasible for their circumstances. They instead granted land to their workers to cultivate on their own, as well as rights to have their voices heard in determining laws via general assemblies. By giving the people, at least some of them, a stake in their own success, the system now geared towards an incentive-based one rather than solely exploitation-based. Other colonies also began to spring up after being granted land by the English crown. The lords of these colonies were given freedom to experiment with different types of government structures, and after failing to implement the feudal systems that had existed in England, they too conformed to the principles on which the Virginia Company began to trend towards. The feudal system they failed to replicate was similar to the Mughal system, in which lords were given ultimate authority over areas, and under them came tenants, or zamindars in India, which further delegated land and labour in order to raise taxes for the lords and the state monarchs in return for wages. Similarly to India, a pseudo-caste system developed, with the lower classes being known as leetmen, and the children also inheriting their status. However, this again acted as a perverse incentive, and this system too collapsed in the US, since there were more attractive alternatives in escaping to the frontier or staying in Europe. Eventually, the colonies became proto-republics in the sense that each was governed by an assembly of all landowners within a district. These were far off the democracies, or more accurately the republic, that came later on, as they refused rights to blacks, women and the poor. However, it still was revolutionary for their time in terms of broadness of political representation. Although rudimentary at this stage, it nonetheless marked the beginnings of a system in which individuals began to equalize wealth and power away from just the monarchs. This crucial restructuring enabled the North American colonizers to gradually pursue greater freedoms both economically and politically. Mexico, on the other hand, drafted a constitution that preserved power amongst their elite classes. Although there was an effort to establish a proposal for popular representation in politics, it unfortunately failed to gather traction. Consequently, their society was structured towards catering for the top classes as a priority. Instead of empowering the common people, it geared towards consolidating monopolies and exploiting the native populace. It was only the wealthy who were able to access essential institutions and services such as acquiring loans, making it very difficult for ordinary people to start their own businesses and expand wealth. Combined with long-lasting political instability and therefore reduced capacity to protect private property rights, the economy of Mexico as a whole lagged behind. Alternatively, the US operated in a far more decentralized manner in terms of power, through senates and wider representation of the common man into politics, albeit at a limited level, but still far greater than Mexico was at the time. This also enabled them to capitalize on the opportunities presented at the advent of the Industrial Revolution. One example of this is the broadening of who could acquire a patent, as well as access to financial institutions. Since patents were relatively inexpensive to acquire, it was easier for a poor person to have the opportunity to invent something new and bring it to the market. The banking sector was monumental in facilitating this, as it allowed access to finances. Since this sector was left largely unrestricted, competition flourished, leading to banks being able to offer low interest rates on loans, essentially making it cheaper to borrow money. In the US, there were 338 banks in 1818, growing rapidly to 27,864 by 1914. Mexico, on the other hand, had only 42 by 1910, two of which controlled 60% of the total banking assets. Due to the lack of competition, interest rates were much higher, effectively shutting off the path of entrepreneurship for Mexico's poorest. Therefore, only the already wealthy could feasibly access these services, and they used it to consolidate their wealth and expand their influence to monopolize existing industries. In the US, if someone had an idea, they were far more likely to get funding and freedom to try it, thereby enabling a greater proportion of the population to start their own enterprises. Naturally, this then led to an increased level of competition amongst the private sector, leading to innovation and wealth expansion for all. Fundamentally, it is the economic freedom that best maximizes the chances for prosperity and the reduction of poverty. The Index of Economic Freedom, developed by the Heritage Foundation, is an annual ranking that measures economic freedom in nations across the world. It takes into account the following 12 factors. Okay, so they're divided up into sort of 4 overall categories. And the first one is the rule of law, and under that you get property rights, government integrity, judicial effectiveness. So the second category is government size, and then that covers government spending, tax burden, fiscal health. The third category is regulatory efficiency, which is about business freedom, labour freedom, monetary freedom. And the fourth category is open markets, so trade freedom, investment freedom, and financial freedom. So at the end of this, actually, what we'll do, we'll go to the appendix, and I'll show you how Azadism sort of biases each one, so which one it wants to have more in and which one has less in, that sort of stuff. We'll go to that at the end. So economic freedom is a good way to judge which countries in the world today are more Azadist and less Azadist, in terms of following these principles, is which countries are more or less economically free. So when looking at nations around the world today, those that tend towards economic freedom show the least amount of poverty and the highest rates of prosperity. Some of the highest scoring nations on the index include Singapore, Hong Kong, New Zealand and South Korea, Ireland and Switzerland. Although not perfect, as each has many issues of their own, these nations nonetheless currently best encapsulate Azadist principles and can be seen as the real-world implementations of many of the ideas present in this manifesto. Combining low tax rates, reduced barriers to entry for business, strong enforcement of property rights, minimize corruption in the government, alongside other policies, have led these nations to become some of the most prosperous regions in history, many of which started as insignificant fishing villages. Wherever freedom has been promoted, those societies improve, and freedom in the economic sense is a necessary part of freedom as a whole. The reason why these correlate is due to the increased wealth enabling far better access to resources and ways of working that give people many options in how to live their own lives. It is upon this, Azadism wishes to export prosperity to any region on the globe by providing similar formulas for success. However much a nation has trended towards freedom, it has equally seen a greater quality of life, healthier and longer lives, as well as generally wealthier. By any metric we can measure, we have seen a rise in prosperity overall as the world has trended towards greater freedoms economically. It is imperative, therefore, that to eliminate poverty, the trend towards freedom continues to rise. Even if inequality may rise as a byproduct, the fact is that all are better off if wealth is grown under Azadist conditions, as opposed to the system in which the colonial powers of the past employed. This is not to say that inequality is not a problem, but instead the major problem with inequality is its perception, and as a result, social stability. It seems as though many people are accustomed to seeing the situation around them for what it is now, rather than the progress that has led to this point. It is reasonable to feel compassion for those going through difficult times and resentment for those that are in complete opposite positions. The fact that these are mostly temporary positions on both sides have been getting better over time is often ignored. What this creates is a sort of social tension between the rich and the poor, which is not to be taken lightly according to Jordan Peterson. This inevitably leads to a situation in which tribalism manifests and groups will compete to gain the government's favour to debilitate the other. In the process, the entire nation suffers. In fact, Karl Marx based much of his ideas off this dichotomy, promoting the idea of a class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. These notions went on to materialise as the horrors of the USSR, in which groups such as the kulaks were sent to gulags and killed en masse. Hitler then took these ideas further by applying his own racial tint, by demonising the Jews, using wealth as a key component of his arguments against them. So what is the best way to tackle it? Azadism suggests that a nation must increase mobility for the poorest in society to reach higher levels of income by removing barriers and maximising opportunity. The previous section delved into the specifics of the harms associated with artificial barriers to entry and restricting competition, whereas this section will now focus on how best to safeguard and promote those who are currently in poor financial positions. The most important focus is to alleviate poverty through maximizing human potential rather than to punish success. So, quote from Jordan Peterson: "There is no doubt that inequality destabilizes societies. I think the social science evidence on that front is crystal clear." To conclude this opening section of part 4 of this manifesto, contemplate this example from Itihas. On visiting their Gursikh by Lallo, Guru Nanak and Bhai Mandana were offered food prepared by the poor carpenter. The government appointed a custodian of the village, Malik Bago, was made aware of Maharaj's arrival and invited him to abandon the peasant's hospitality and to partake in his feast instead. After initially declining, he brought with him a roti from Bhai Lallo's house. In one hand he held Bhai Lallo's and in the other Bago's. When squeezed, the former secreted milk and the latter oozed blood. A powerful metaphor highlighting the corruption of Bago and the cruelty in which he treated his workers. Whereas milk symbolized the purity of Bhai Lallo's nature and hard work. The Guru saw Bago's exploitation clearly and recognized his hubris and greed. The problem here was not his wealth, it was the means in which he obtained it. The later manifestations of the Guru controlled vast amounts of wealth relative to the average population of the time. Were they also immoral for being so rich? Wealth is only a tool, same way weapons or wagons are. The nature of those who use them should be the primary concern. Azadists should be concerned less with how much someone has and only how they obtained it. If it was through breaching the NAP, then it is illegitimate, and only then it is deemed immoral. If it is through providing a good or service that people are willing to have willingly paid for, then no issue should be raised at a state level. It is not automatically true that someone who owns a lot of wealth is by default consumed by greed and attachment. When Raja Janak was told that his kingdom was engulfed in flames, along with all his worldly possessions, he remained unmoved, preferring to listen to the sermons of his guru. Instead, it was the Brahmins, who owned nothing but their janu and 2 sets of clothes, one set which was currently burning in the palace, who ran to save their belongings. So King Janak was the great saint who amidst Maya remained indifferent to it, from Bhai Gurdas's Vala. So taxes. The two primary functions of tax are 1. Pay for public goods, and 2. Redistribute wealth. The first function is largely defunct in an Azadist economy, since most industries are eventually privatized and handed over to the market. Most tax revenue would initially be used to uphold the government's main security and justice functions. However, even this should be eventually phased out over time to be replaced by the Svand-based approach. This subsection will largely focus on the second function of taxes. Traditionally, to combat inequality in a society, it is common to hear that higher taxes should be imposed on the rich in order to give more to the poor. However, the real-world implications of these sort of Robin Hood tactics have a significant drawback. Firstly, imagine raising corporate tax on the largest, most successful firms to force them to give back. By excessively taxing these firms, it becomes increasingly unprofitable for them to continue in that region, and so they become more inclined to move their operations elsewhere. This negatively impacts the economy as they take with them the many benefits they provided in terms of employment, further investment, and potential access to goods and services. So instead of having the intended outcome of increasing government tax revenue from that particular company, the state now takes nothing. For example, if country A had a corporate tax rate of 50% but B had a rate of 10%, then logically, a corporation would want to operate in country B, since the cost to them to do business is far lower. Obviously, just like a real market, there would be many other variables that factor into these decisions, such as political stability, geography, access to labour, etc. But taxes would indeed form a major part of this decision, as we have seen with many large firms moving headquarters to Ireland in particular. Simply increasing taxes without providing any other benefits or incentives for businesses to remain is a shallow solution and is more likely to be counterproductive. The same way a trader can't justify excessively high prices for a product that can be bought cheaper elsewhere, a government cannot simply increase the quote-unquote price to do business in the nation without offering a fair deal in return. Furthermore, the loss of opportunity for employment as well as a reduction in competition and goods and services offered would further harm the very people that this policy aimed to help. By creating a disincentive for business, naturally the number of businesses would decrease. The same applies not just the corporations, but the individuals themselves. As alluded to throughout this manifesto, the power of incentives is not to be understated. It is important to highlight that imposing a higher cost on financial success would lead to people understanding that they have less to gain by achieving those levels of success. Why would you work to achieve something when there's an increasingly larger portion of it gets taken away in taxes? It would make more sense to someone achieving high levels of financial gain to move elsewhere in order to preserve or further expand their wealth in other places, taking with them the entrepreneurial skills that would have otherwise benefited the population of their domestic nation. Alongside the retention of wealth argument, another factor to consider is the loss of domestic investment. By increasing taxes on the rich and large businesses, they are now left with far less money to invest in capital. Money which would have otherwise been used to obtain better equipment, expand operations, or hire more workers, has now gone to the government to redistribute according to their own opinion on how best it would be spent. In other words, the money that would have been reinvested in the economy has now been seized by the state to reallocate as they see fit. This revenue is now vastly dependent on whether the authorities are competent enough to adequately determine where this money should go rather than the market. Instead of this money being reinvested in a way that a more efficient organisation would benefit from and in turn benefit others, in terms of more employment, better goods and services, etc., it is likely to go into inefficient state programs that operate outside of the traditional market forces, neither adequately observing price signalling nor adapting to consumer demand. Alternatively, it may go towards funding wars that no one agrees with or be thrown at failing public organisations in the hope that more funding will solve all its problems. Instead of letting the market decide where to allocate resources based on demand and supply, the government decides where these should be used. All the while, chunks of this revenue is pocketed by politicians and bureaucrats in the process. The private firm being taxed, who initially made the profits, already proved its ability to allocate resources in such a way that meets the demands of the people. How does it then make sense to let the government gamble these earnings on a non-market, uncompetitive enterprises that do not adhere to the laws of demand and supply? In a market environment, if a firm is allocating these resources inefficiently, then it itself will suffer the consequences and potentially fail, thus freeing up those resources for other more efficient businesses to manage. Whereas in a state redistribution system, it is the taxpayer who pays for the inefficiency of government enterprise. Although the intent may have been to help by redistributing to those in need, the actual outcomes may end up worse than intended. The market mechanism is what best redistributes wealth, when government gets out of the way and makes it easier for competition to increase affordability and options for the people. We should also consider that in reality, many of the high-income earners actually use tax avoidance schemes and spend their money on a creative counting to get around paying these high taxes. Other methods include them placing their money into tax-protected bonds and other securities, which would have otherwise been used in the economy. With convoluted tax systems, it is far easier for accountants hired by the richest in society to get around having to pay these rates by finding and exploiting both legal and illegal loopholes. This is not available to the poorer in society, since they cannot afford the fees to hire professionals specialising in this practice. On top of this, the experiment in excessively taxing the rich has already been tried. In 1921, the tax rate for earners over $100,000 in the US was 73%. During this time, $700 million in tax revenues was raised, but only 30% of this class of earners paid taxes. But when this rate was steadily decreased to 24% by 1929, 65% paid and over $1 billion was collected in tax revenues. Paradoxically, not only was more revenue raised with a lower tax rate, the coverage was also greater. Sowell explains that this was no mystery, but was actually due to the high-income earners being free to use their earnings to reinvest into the economy, rather than tax-exempt securities or other creative accounting methods. This reinvestment promoted greater output, employment and wages, which in turn further raised the coverage since more income was available to be taxed, despite the lower rate. What may have initially seemed obvious, that simply increase the tax rate will increase the tax revenue, the reality is that the relationship is actually an inverse one for the most part. Despite this, the tax burden still does not fall onto the lower classes of earners, either with the US at least. Despite the progressive tax system and higher tax rates on the rich, it is still high-income earners who end up contributing the most to the overall tax revenue. This is because of the actual effective tax rate, which takes into account the amount paid in taxes minus the amount given back in federal transfers. When looking at this, on average, only the top 40% actually pay taxes more than they receive back from the government, if they receive anything at all. Under Azadism, a lower tax rate and a simpler system overall would be employed initially. Since the role of the state is far diminished, there would be less need for such a high tax revenue in the first place. Secondly, this would help retain wealthy individuals and businesses due to lowering costs of their success, making the nation more competitive in attracting wealth rather than to discourage it. By setting corporate taxes to zero, it would also help remove barriers to entry, as the cost of setting up and maintaining businesses is reduced. This all returns a net positive in terms of stimulation of the economy in forms such as increasing employment, availability of goods and services, and promoting competition and innovation. As well as this, providing a simpler tax system by removing unnecessary taxes and progressive rates will help to remove the incentive to exploit loopholes and even increase the difficulty in finding them in the first place. If before you were being taxed 70% of your income, and by hiring an accountant, which would charge their own high fees, to in theory cut the cost you pay by half. Why then would they do this if the tax rate is far below the 35% in the first place? Again, incentives must be considered in any tax policy suggested. Instead of the multi-tiered tax brackets and the vast variety of tax types, a flat tax on something like income would be implemented initially. This tax rate would apply to all eligible equally. As discussed above, there is little concern about raising enough revenue with a lower rate, even though coverage is likely to increase anyway, and therefore also revenues. This simpler tax system makes it far more difficult to find loopholes and counteracts the incentive for the wealthy to use loopholes to begin with. For instance, the economist Milton Friedman calculated that under a flat tax system, the USA in 1962 could have raised the same amount of revenue with only a flat 23.5% tax rate. At that time, the highest brackets went up to a mind-boggling 91%. Combine this with small size of government and with the most industry privatized is more likely for a national debt to transition into surpluses. These surpluses would then be used to further tweak the tax rate to let people keep their wealth rather than have the government squander it. Any excess should be handed straight back in full. The simpler and lower tax rate on the wealthy will also aid in attracting foreign investment, bringing with it increased opportunities for all in the nation. With many of the inefficient, costly programs the government provides removed, the private sector will take on most of these functions instead. By having lower costs to do business, it makes it far easier for the people themselves to provide these solutions and compete with each other to create the best possible product or service at the best possible price. The minimal tax rate applied equally to everyone will fund the remaining state functions. However, Azadism being a dynamic philosophy, even this is temporary. Taxes theft. The reader may recall at the beginning of part 3 the topic of Langar Daswand choice. In there, it was made clear the immoral implications of a tax-funded enterprise compared to a Daswand-based one. For the reasons outlined there, an Azadist economy would eventually seek to phase out taxes altogether in favour of voluntary donations. The responsibility is increasingly placed on the people themselves to fund the systems in place to protect them, even if there are free riders. Equally, if the government wants to continue to exist, then it must provide something of value to the people. This also maintains the balance of power between government and the people, as it gives the latter a greater ability to restrict the income of the government. On the 15th of February 2003, one of the largest protests in recorded history were held against the invasion of Iraq. At the time, it was clear to see public sentiment regarding this. However, the politicians had the final say and went ahead anyway. By having a donation-based system, the government is in a much more reliant position. If these nations were operating under Azadism, then the people would have withheld the funding necessary to engage in that war. The government would be financially handicapped to sustain any sort of campaign in that region, whereas with a tax-based approach, the people are extorted for their money regardless of whether they support the cause or not. By the very nature of taxes, each individual in a society is in part funding the indiscriminate drone strikes that murder both insurgents and children alike. Your earnings maintain the government monopolies on the ineffective industries that would have otherwise innovated to find cures to dangerous diseases or educated a population of innovators. You fund so-called wars on drugs, terror and poverty that in reality tend to exacerbate these crucial issues further. If you refuse to participate, you yourself are labelled an enemy of the state and are kidnapped and thrown into a cage. Tax is fundamentally plunder. It is the acquisition of the people's property or hard work and labour in the form of money through the force or the threat of force. Governments use the guise of protection in order to justify it, but how is this different to a mafia? From murder to trafficking, if this manifesto listed the extent of the crimes of which government commits in the name of protecting its citizens, this publication would become too voluminous. To recognise this reality is crucial. Despite this, Azadism is not so radical in its approach that it is delusional about consequences. Doing away with taxes overnight is likely to be devastating. Large changes such as these require time to phase out in stages. Many current systems of support provided by the state, however inefficient, could lead to disaster if removed too quickly for those that currently rely on them. Alternatives need time to arise and replace the state. Therefore, the tax reform process could follow this general order in order to give time for the private sector to develop. So number one, first, a flat tax rate system is implemented. All tax brackets are removed to leave one universal rate. Any other types of tax eliminated, leaving only income tax or another alternative such as consumption or land value tax, since these could be argued to be far more appropriate to Azadist principles. 2. Then, over time, the tax collection responsibility is devolved to smaller levels, beginning with the individual states and then further down to more local authority levels, perhaps even individual cities and towns. These specific local gathering units will be detailed in the final part, but for now they will start being free to decrease the tax rate but not increase, their revenue being gradually replaced by donation if required. Number 3, eventually each city or town is able to set their own rate or none at all. This gives time for private sector to develop and people's wealth to increase simultaneously. Those local units that refuse to reduce rates would initially be subject to market forces, where people could just move away, eventually restricting the local government's abilities. After a certain point, it would just be treated as theft, and the national security forces would be justified to put an end to this. Ultimately, the goal would be a taxless society where even the state's function could be replaced by competing private entities. Private courts and security services could replace the final state functions. However, this is a very long-term vision and may or may not be realised depending on the progress of the previous stages and ultimately the will of the people. It is more reasonable to suggest that this be experimented with on smaller scales to begin with and then have the successful models exported to other localities if they wish to adopt it. Otherwise, if all residents of a particular area agreed to pay into a fund pool voluntarily, acting as a pseudo-tax of sorts, then this is also acceptable. And this already exists to some extent around the world with communes and other small communities. Since it is all voluntary participation, this is perfectly acceptable under an Azadist system. This is not a foreign concept to Sikhi either, and given the description of the ideal city, Begumpura, albeit likely metaphorical, Bhagavad Avidas gives one of the qualities of the city to be free from taxes on goods. So from Guru Granth Sahib 345, there are no troubles with taxes or commodity there. Alongside this, other qualities prescribed relate to the social equality in terms of status and wealth and prosperity. The reader is encouraged to read the whole Shabad on StudyGranth.org and explore the meaning of each word. Searching up the term tax on Gurbani search engines outputs a fairly clear perception of tax collectors too, often associated with Yamma Azriya, the messenger of death. It is a shame how amongst the Sikh Sangat of today especially, attitudes towards taxes can often be supportive and treated as a preferential government activity. It just highlights the level of docility amongst the Panth today and the distilling of our Guru's teachings. Today we are happy being taxed and having the money we work for taken from us to fund the most unethical causes. Rare is it to hear any sort of outrage against this constant theft, from the Khalsa in particular. Instead, the opposite is encouraged when seeing support for political parties that raise taxes and further increase the size of the government. However, here is the response our Guru gave to the Hill Raja when they demanded taxes of him. So this is from Suraj Prakash. The highest plume-wearing Guru Gobind Singh, like thunder from giant clouds, roared. The scribe began writing his response, which would strike pain in the heart of the Hill Raja. Listen, you cocky Bhim Chand, convey this message to all the other kings as well. If you want to collect your tax, I will give it to you on the edge of my karag. On the tip of our spears and arrows, we will give you your tax as we chop you into pieces. We will rain down your money with our bullets. Come test the large amount of money we have set for you. No one is as much as an idiot and fool as you. If you want your money, come face to face with me. Our warriors will ferociously clash iron with your iron. Come then and test this money. Again, that's the words of Sri Guru Gobind Singh Ji from Suraj Prakash. However, again, Azadism recognizes this as an ideal and not something immediately practical in this time. Instead, this should be viewed as a direction to head towards, or an attitude towards taxes that should be re-adopted rather than something that needs to be removed overnight. Therefore, keeping in mind this compromise, the rest of this section will now focus on how the minimal taxes left could be used to help the disadvantaged as well as other methods directly to help the poor.
ਤੁਰ ਹੀ ਤੋਲ ਨਗਾਰੇ ਬਾਜ ਕੁਰ ਹੀ